There is a particular kind of silence that only exists at 2 in the morning in a home you've lived in long enough to stop noticing. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of familiarity. The refrigerator hum you've learned to tune out, the occasional tick of the heating pipes behind the drywall, the faint, rhythmic breath of a house that has settled into itself over decades. Joel had learned every note in that orchestra. He had been working from this room for 3 years, and by now the silence felt like a second skin. The home office was small, but organized in the way only obsessives manage, everything serving a purpose, everything in its place. A wide oak desk dominated the far wall, positioned deliberately away from the window to eliminate ambient street noise. To the left, a full-length mirror in a dark wooden frame leaned against the wall at a slight angle, inherited from the previous tenant and never moved because Joel had simply never thought about it enough to bother. A blackout curtain sealed the window. 3 acoustic foam panels lined the wall behind the monitor. And at the center of it all, elevated on a short boom arm, was the condenser microphone, matte black, professional grade, the tool that paid Joel's rent. He was a freelance voice actor, had been for 6 years. Commercials, audiobooks, corporate training videos, the occasional video game side character with 3 lines of dialogue. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his. He set his own hours, answered to no one between sessions, and spent his evenings in that quiet room reading scripts and recording takes until the work was done. Most nights he finished by midnight. Some nights, like this one, the deadline pushed him past 2. The project was a 12-part documentary narration, dense, serious, slow-paced. His producer, Renata, needed the first 4 chapters delivered by Friday morning, which meant tonight was the 3rd consecutive late session. Joel had already recorded and re-recorded the opening twice. His voice was starting to dry at the edges, the consonants losing their crispness, and he'd been sipping lukewarm tea between paragraphs to keep the warmth in his throat. He pulled up the 4th paragraph of Chapter 2, adjusted the gain slightly on his audio interface, and hit the red record button. The moment the recording light glowed, he began to read. He was 2 sentences in when he saw it, or thought he saw it. That's the thing about the first time. Your brain does everything in its power to explain it away before you've even consciously registered what you've seen. The mirror was in his peripheral vision, angled just enough that it caught the edge of his desk and a slice of the wall behind his chair. He had sat in this room so many nights that the mirror's reflection was as familiar as the back of his own hand. He knew exactly what it should show: the corner of the desk, the acoustic foam, the faint red glow of the recording light bouncing off the ceiling, and his own profile, visible from the shoulder up if he glanced left. What he saw in the first half-second before his brain cataloged it was a vertical shape, tall, positioned just behind his shoulder in the reflection. He turned, instinctively, immediately, and there was nothing behind him. Just the wall, just the acoustic foam, just the familiar, unbroken quiet of the room he had sat in for so many nights. He sat still for a moment, his script forgotten on the monitor. He looked back at the mirror. Nothing, just his reflection, his desk, his cables, his room. He blinked a few times and reached up to rub his eyes. Eye strain, he thought. 3 nights of reading small point script on a bright monitor. Makes sense. He looked at the recording light still glowing red and realized he'd paused mid-sentence. He rewound the take, deleted the last 15 seconds, and began again. He was 5 sentences into the retake when it happened again. This time, he didn't turn. He kept reading, kept his voice level and smooth, but he let his eyes drift left, slowly, carefully, the way you do when you don't want to startle something. And there it was, in the mirror, a shape positioned directly behind his left shoulder, tall, taller than the wall behind him should have allowed, dark, not the kind of dark that is simply the absence of light, but a dark that had texture to it, a density, like something that absorbed light rather than merely occluded it. It had no face, no features at all, just a vertical mass of shadow that stood behind him in the reflection of a room that contained no such thing. Joel's voice faltered on the word documentation. He stopped the recording. He turned slowly in his chair and stared at the wall behind him. Acoustic foam, a small hook with a pair of headphones, the corner where the two walls met, painted a neutral gray. Nothing else. He stood up, walked to the mirror, and examined the reflection from directly in front of it. His own face looked back at him, pale from the monitor light, eyes slightly red at the rims. He leaned close to the glass. He pressed his hand against it. Cold, but it was always cold. Glass held the temperature of the room, and the room gets cool at night. Nothing unusual. He sat back down. He opened a new take, hit record. The light went red. And in the mirror, quietly, without hesitation, the tall, dark shape stepped back into the frame. This time, it was closer than before. Joel told himself, in the rational hours of the following afternoon, that he had simply been working too hard. This was the story he rehearsed as he made coffee and scrolled through the completed session's audio files, checking them for quality the way he did every morning. The narration was clean, his tone was steady. There was nothing wrong with the recording, and there was nothing wrong with the room, and there was certainly nothing standing in the mirror of his home office at 2 a.m. He was sleep-deprived. He was staring at a bright screen in a dark room with an old mirror positioned at a suggestive angle. The human brain was a pattern recognition machine, and it was very, very good at manufacturing shapes in ambiguous darkness. This was not a mystery. This was biology. He delivered chapters 1 and 2 to Renata by 3 p.m, received a clean approval message by 5, and ate dinner with the lights in the kitchen turned all the way up. He began chapter 3 at 10 that night, earlier than usual. He told himself this was to get ahead of the deadline. He did not examine the secondary reason, that starting earlier meant finishing earlier, and finishing earlier meant the room would feel less profoundly alone. The session began normally. He ran his vocal warm-up, adjusted his chair, and pulled up the script on his monitor. He had been recording for perhaps 12 minutes when he looked at the mirror. The shape was there immediately, as if it had been waiting, but it was different now. On the first night, the form had been indistinct, a vertical smear of darkness, like a shadow without a source, something you might almost argue was a trick of the light if you were committed enough to the argument. Tonight, there was no such ambiguity. The shape had definition, edges. Joel could see that it was tall, genuinely, wrongly tall, the kind of height that would require a ceiling higher than the one in his room, and that its proportions were subtly off in ways that registered as deeply uncomfortable without being immediately catalogable. The limbs were too long, the torso too narrow. The head sat at the top of the figure in a way that seemed slightly too large for the neck that supported it, and yet that neck was barely visible at all, just a thin, dark column connecting the mass of the body to the mass of the head. It had no face. This was clear now in a way it hadn't been the night before. Not masked, not obscured, simply featureless. Where a human face would have the topography of eyes, nose, and mouth, This thing had a smooth, slightly convex surface, matte and lightless, and the texture of it. He could see the texture now in a way he hadn't been able to before. It was wrong. It had the quality of something very still and very wet, a surface that caught no highlights, that absorbed the faint ambient light of the room without returning any of it. Oily. That was the only word Joel could hold on to. The thing in the mirror looked like it was made of something oily and dark and absolutely deliberate. He kept recording. He wasn't sure why. He kept his voice even and continued narrating Chapter 3 while his eyes moved between his script and the mirror, back and forth, with the controlled rhythm of someone trying very hard not to appear frightened. And then the shape did something new. Joel's voice was moving through a passage about the discovery of old shipping manifests, steady, unhurried, his standard documentary cadence, and he was holding perfectly still in his chair, the way he always did during a take, posture neutral, hands resting on the desk. He was not moving. He had checked this twice with a conscious, deliberate awareness of his own body, because he needed to be certain. The shape tilted its head. Not a large movement, not dramatic, just a slow, smooth rotation of that featureless oval toward the right shoulder. The way a person tilts their head when something interests them, when they are listening particularly carefully. Joel had not moved. Joel's head was straight, but in the mirror, the dark figure behind him had turned its head at the neck with a fluid, quiet deliberateness that bore no relationship to anything Joel was doing. It was no longer mimicking him. It was watching him. Joel stopped the recording. He pressed the mute button. He watched the red light die, and he watched the shape in the mirror stand completely still for 3 full seconds, head still tilted, and then dissolve. Not disappear, dissolve, like smoke losing coherence. The edges softened, the density thinned, and in the space of a few seconds, there was nothing left but his own reflection and the familiar, untroubled angles of his room. He sat forward in his chair and pulled up the audio file on his DAW. He played back the last 40 seconds before the mute. He heard his own voice, clear and professional, moving through the manifest passage. He heard the room tone beneath it, that thin, consistent background noise that every recording space has, specific as a fingerprint. He reached for his headphones and put them on, turning the monitoring volume higher than he usually kept it. He played it again. There, beneath his voice, beneath the room tone, a sound that should not have been there. Breathing. Not his. He knew the sound of his own breathing on a track, the occasional nasal catch, the particular rhythm of his inhale between sentences. This was something else. It was low, rhythmic in a way that felt off, the intervals slightly too long between each cycle, the sound itself carrying a resonance that his condenser mic should not have been able to capture. It was human breathing in the way that a recording of a human breathing sounds, emptied of warmth, flattened into pure mechanical rhythm. He listened to it 6 more times. He saved the file separately and labeled it Session 3 Anomaly, Breathing. Then he sat back in his chair, looked at the dark mirror, and thought about the tilt of the head, the independent movement, the thing that meant it was no longer just reflecting him, no longer just an echo of his voice and his gestures in some secondary dimension behind the glass. It had looked at him of its own volition. It had expressed in the only language it seemed capable of, something that felt unmistakably like interest. He thought about the fact that it only appeared when the microphone was live, that it froze completely when he muted it. He had tested this 3 times now, muted, unmuted, muted, and the result was consistent. The red light was the trigger, or the sound was, or the frequency of his voice traveling through the air and into the diaphragm of the condenser mic. Something about the act of recording summoned it, anchored it, kept it present. He did not know what that meant, but he knew that he had 2 chapters left to deliver and a deadline in 36 hours, and a dark, oily shape in his mirror that had just reminded him quietly and precisely that it had a will of its own. He opened the script for Chapter 4. He hit record. The red light came on, and in the mirror, from the dark place it went when the microphone was silent, the tall figure returned. And this time, it was standing closer. The cold spot appeared on the second pass of Chapter 4, roughly 50 minutes into the session. Joel noticed it the way you noticed most things that are quietly, persistently wrong, not as a single dramatic moment, but as a slow accumulation of small observations that finally adds up to something undeniable. First, his left arm was cold. He had attributed it to the hour, to the room losing heat after midnight, and he had reached for the hoodie draped over the back of his chair and pulled it on without stopping the recording. But the cold persisted through the fabric in a way that didn't make sense for a room that had simply cooled overnight. It had a direction to it. It was coming from his left. He finished the paragraph, stopped the take, sat still. He extended his left arm slowly, palm down, and moved it laterally through the air in the direction of the mirror. The temperature dropped in clear gradient. The further left he reached, the closer to the glass, the colder the air became. Not the uniform coolness of a poorly insulated room, a localized cold, as focused as the beam of a flashlight, radiating from a point approximately 4 feet off the floor on the surface of the mirror. 4 feet off the floor. He looked at the mirror. He looked at where the shadow stood when the microphone was live, the lower portion of the figure, the area that would correspond roughly to its torso. He thought about the height of the cold spot. He thought about how precisely it corresponded. He reached forward and turned the microphone back on. The red light came up. The shape appeared in the mirror, and the cold hit his left arm like stepping through a doorway. Joel watched the figure in the mirror carefully. It was in its usual position, directly behind his reflected shoulder, slightly right of center, but he was now examining the space around it with the analytical attention of someone looking at a problem rather than a threat, or trying to. The cold radiating from the glass was intense enough that he could see, when he exhaled, a faint cloud of condensation drifting leftward from his breath, in a room that was not, by any reasonable measurement, cold enough to produce visible breath. He reached out slowly and pressed 2 fingertips against the mirror's surface. The cold came up through his fingertips and into his bones immediately, the kind of cold that moves from surface into bone faster than physics should allow. But that wasn't what stopped him. What stopped him was the texture. The mirror felt wrong, not cracked, not damaged, wrong in the way a surface feels when something is pressing against it from the other side. There was a resistance to it, a subtle give, like the glass had infinitesimally less structural integrity than it should, like it was being pushed, very gently, very persistently, from behind. He yanked his hand back. In the mirror, the shape had turned its featureless face directly toward him. Joel got up from his desk. He crossed the room in 3 steps and stood in front of the mirror at full height, looking into it from less than 2 feet away. His reflection stared back at him, eyes wide, jaw tight. Behind his reflection, the shape loomed. He could see now at this proximity just how tall it was. The top of its head cleared the top of the mirror's frame. It was not contained by the glass. It extended beyond the visible boundary of the reflection into a space that should have been above the ceiling of his office. He stared at the featureless surface of its face and tried to understand what he was looking at. He pressed his hand flat against the glass, and the shape pressed back. Not a dramatic shudder, not an earthquake, the gentlest, most deliberate forward movement of a hand from somewhere inside the mirror, the dark surface of its palm pressing against the inside of the glass, exactly where Joel's hand was pressed against the outside. He could see the frost forming immediately, the kind of cold that moves from surface into bone faster than physics should allow. But that wasn't what stopped him. What stopped him was the texture. The mirror felt wrong. Not cracked, not damaged. Wrong in the way a surface feels when something is pressing against it from the other side. There was a resistance to it, a subtle give, like the glass had infinitesimally less structural integrity than it should, like it was being pushed very gently, very persistently from behind. He yanked his hand back. In the mirror, the shape had turned its featureless face directly toward him. Joel got up from his desk. He crossed the room in 3 steps and stood in front of the mirror at full height, looking into it from less than 2 feet away. His reflection stared back at him, eyes wide, jaw tight. Behind his reflection, the shape loomed. He could see now at this proximity just how tall it was. The top of its head cleared the top of the mirror's frame. It was not contained by the glass. It extended beyond the visible boundary of the reflection into a space that should have been above the ceiling of his office. He stared at the featureless surface of its face and tried to understand what he was looking at. He pressed his hand flat against the glass, and the shape pressed back. Not a dramatic shudder, not an earthquake, the gentlest, most deliberate forward movement of a hand from somewhere inside the mirror, the dark surface of its palm pressing against the inside of the glass, exactly where Joel's hand was pressed against the outside. He could see the frost forming immediately, the kind of cold that moves from surface into bone faster than physics should allow. But that wasn't what stopped him. What stopped him was the texture. The mirror felt wrong. Not cracked, not damaged. Wrong in the way a surface feels when something is pressing against it from the other side. There was a resistance to it, a subtle give, like the glass had infinitesimally less structural integrity than it should, like it was being pushed very gently, very persistently from behind. He yanked his hand back. In the mirror, the shape had turned its featureless face directly toward him. Joel got up from his desk. He crossed the room in 3 steps and stood in front of the mirror at full height, looking into it from less than 2 feet away. His reflection stared back at him, eyes wide, jaw tight. Behind his reflection, the shape loomed. He could see now at this proximity just how tall it was. The top of its head cleared the top of the mirror's frame. It was not contained by the glass. It extended beyond the visible boundary of the reflection into a space that should have been above the ceiling of his office. He stared at the featureless surface of its face and tried to understand what he was looking at. He pressed his hand flat against the glass, and the shape pressed back. Not a dramatic shudder, not an earthquake, the gentlest, most deliberate forward movement of a hand from somewhere inside the mirror, the dark surface of its palm pressing against the inside of the glass, exactly where Joel's hand was pressed against the outside. He could see the frost forming immediately, the kind of cold that moves from surface into bone faster than physics should allow. But that wasn't what stopped him. What stopped him was the texture. The mirror felt wrong. Not cracked, not damaged. Wrong in the way a surface feels when something is pressing against it from the other side. There was a resistance to it, a subtle give, like the glass had infinitesimally less structural integrity than it should, like it was being pushed very gently, very persistently from behind. He yanked his hand back. In the mirror, the shape had turned its featureless face directly toward him. Joel got up from his desk. He crossed the room in 3 steps and stood in front of the mirror at full height, looking into it from less than 2 feet away. His reflection stared back at him, eyes wide, jaw tight. Behind his reflection, the shape loomed. He could see now at this proximity just how tall it was. The top of its head cleared the top of the mirror's frame. It was not contained by the glass. It extended beyond the visible boundary of the reflection into a space that should have been above the ceiling of his office. He stared at the featureless surface of its face and tried to understand what he was looking at. He pressed his hand flat against the glass, and the shape pressed back. Not a dramatic shudder, not an earthquake, the gentlest, most deliberate forward movement of a hand from somewhere inside the mirror, the dark surface of its palm pressing against the inside of the glass, exactly where Joel's hand was pressed against the outside. He could see the frost forming immediately, the kind of cold that moves from surface into bone faster than physics should allow. But that wasn't what stopped him. What stopped him was the texture. The mirror felt wrong. Not cracked, not damaged. Wrong in the way a surface feels when something is pressing against it from the other side. There was a resistance to it, a subtle give, like the glass had infinitesimally less structural integrity than it should, like it was being pushed very gently, very persistently from behind. He yanked his hand back. In the mirror, the shape had turned its featureless face directly toward him. Joel got up from his desk. He crossed the room in 3 steps and stood in front of the mirror at full height, looking into it from less than 2 feet away. His reflection stared back at him, eyes wide, jaw tight. Behind his reflection, the shape loomed. He could see now, at this proximity, just how tall it was. The top of its head cleared the top of the mirror's frame. It was not contained by the glass. It extended beyond the visible boundary of the reflection into a space that should have been above the ceiling of his office. He stared at the featureless surface of its face and tried to understand what he was looking at. He pressed his hand flat against the glass, and the shape pressed back. Not a dramatic shudder, not an earthquake, the gentlest, most deliberate forward movement of a hand from somewhere inside the mirror, the dark surface of its palm pressing against the inside of the glass, exactly where Joel's hand was pressed against the outside. He could see the frost forming immediately, a pattern spreading outward from the point of contact in thin crystalline branches, spreading across the glass surface with a slow botanical inevitability. He pulled his hand away. The frost pattern remained. He breathed on it to see if it would melt. It didn't. He watched it for a full minute. It simply sat there in perfect stillness, a dark handprint outlined in frost, preserved on the surface of a mirror in a room whose temperature absolutely should not have allowed it to form or persist. He backed away from the mirror. He sat down at his desk. He played back the recording from the last session, the anomalous breathing track he had saved the night before. He loaded it into his audio editor and ran a spectral analysis on it, the kind of visualization that showed frequency and amplitude over time as a color map. The breathing was there in the low end, a cycling pattern of compression and release, rhythmically consistent. But there was something else in the analysis that he hadn't heard when listening normally. Above the breathing pattern, in a frequency range above the threshold of easy human hearing, there were pulses, evenly spaced, structured, not random noise, not microphone artifact, something that looked, in the spectral visualization, like repetition, like the same short pattern of tonal frequencies recurring at precise intervals, like a response. He had been speaking into the microphone, and something had been responding. He saved the spectral analysis as an image. He emailed it to himself. Then he sat in the cold of his home office and looked at the frost handprint on the mirror, and he thought about the fact that the shape had pressed its hand against the glass from the inside, and that the frost it left behind had not melted, and that the glass had felt different when he touched it, as if it were under pressure, and that whatever was on the other side of that mirror had been listening to his voice for 3 nights and was, by every available measure, trying to get closer. He looked at his phone. He thought about calling Dom. He thought about what he would say. There's a thing in my mirror that only shows up when I'm recording, and it pressed its hand against the glass tonight and left a frost print, and I think it's been responding to me in ultrasonic frequency. He put the phone back down. He looked at the script. Chapter 4 was 60% complete. Chapter 5 was untouched. The deadline was tomorrow at 9 in the morning. He looked at the frost handprint on the mirror. In the cold of the room, it sat perfectly still. 5 elongated fingers, the palm just slightly too large, the proportions subtly and unmistakably wrong. Not a human hand. Close, but not quite. He would finish the recording tomorrow. He got up, turned off the desk lamp, and left the room without looking back. But as he pulled the door shut behind him, he heard something, or thought he heard it. He stood in the hallway with his hand on the doorknob, perfectly still, his breath held. From behind the closed door, in the silent, darkened room, came the sound of something breathing. Joel did not sleep well. He lay in his bedroom down the hall and listened to the house's nighttime sounds with an attention he had not given them since childhood, cataloging every creak and pipe knock and settling groan, filtering them against the thing he was trying not to think about. By 6 in the morning, he gave up on sleep entirely and made coffee in a kitchen where all the lights were on, and he sat at the small table with his hands around the mug and thought with the deliberate, structured calm of someone who knows that panic is not a useful tool. The facts, as he understood them, the entity appeared only when the microphone was live. It was summoned by, or perhaps tethered to, the act of recording. It had evolved over 3 sessions from a vague outline to a defined, textured, physically present force that could interact with the mirror from the inside. It had breathed into his microphone. It was responding to his voice in frequencies outside easy human hearing. And last night, it had pressed its hand against the glass, and the frost it left behind had persisted through the night, and he knew this because he had opened the office door at 6:15 in the morning and looked at the mirror from the doorway, and the handprint was still there in the cold, flat light. What he could not establish, and what occupied the center of his thinking, was the question of motive. Entities in horror films always had clear motivations: revenge, hunger, possession, territorial instinct. Whatever was in his mirror did not announce itself. It didn't speak, didn't write on the walls, didn't manifest in the classical theatrical modes of haunting. It simply appeared when the microphone was on, and it got closer every session, and the only consistent thing Joel could measure was the correlation between his voice and its presence. He thought about the word tethered again. He opened the office at 7 that morning and sat down at his desk in full daylight, both windows covered, every light on. He did not hit record. He sat in the lit room and looked at the mirror, his reflection, the desk, the room. No shadow in the glass. But the recording light flickered. One sharp, isolated flicker, not a power surge, not an interface hiccup, a precise single blink of the red light that Joel had been using long enough to know was not normal behavior. He looked at his interface. All connections were secure. The gain levels were stable. He looked at the USB cable running from his interface to his computer and watched, with a calm he did not feel, as the cable moved. It didn't fall, didn't swing. It moved with a slow, deliberate lateral drift, as if something had brushed against it while passing. He looked at the space beside his desk. The air there was intensely cold. He kept recording. He kept his voice level and steady as he read Chapter 4's remaining pages, and all the while he was tracking the cold with his peripheral vision and his skin, the way you track a sound in a dark room, not by looking directly at it, but by staying very aware of everything at once. The cold moved. It was not stationary. It circulated through the room the way a presence circulates, drifting, pausing, drifting again. Once, while Joel was reading a passage about archival record-keeping, he felt the cold settle directly behind his chair, close enough that he could feel it radiating against the back of his neck through the hood of his sweater. He did not stop reading. He finished Chapter 4 at 9:20 and stopped only to save the file and immediately opened Chapter 5 script. He would edit later. He would edit after the deadline. He told himself this without examining the secondary reason, which was that stopping the recording meant the red light going dark, and when the red light went dark, the shape retreated to wherever it went, and Joel was no longer certain that was better. At least while the microphone was live, he could track it. He could feel where the cold was. The moment he muted, the cold would vanish, and he would have no way of knowing where the entity was, or whether disappearing from the mirror meant disappearing from the room at all. Because that was the question that had been forming in the back of his mind since the shape had stepped out of the mirror's frame that morning, and he had been refusing to look at it directly, the way you refuse to look at something when you know that looking at it will make it real. The mirror had been the boundary. The glass had been the limit. For 3 sessions, the entity had existed on the other side, pressing against the frame, pressing against the glass, leaving frost and cold in the world on Joel's side, while remaining confined to the world on the other. And this morning it had stepped out of the frame. The question was, where had it gone? He felt the cold move behind his chair again. He smelled something, faint but unmistakable. Ozone, like the air before a lightning strike, sharp and mineral, and under it something older, dust that had been undisturbed for a very long time, the smell of a place that nothing living had entered in years. The smell of somewhere that was not his office bleeding through into his office like a signal from a badly tuned radio. He was most of the way through Chapter 5 when the cable moved again. This time it was not a brush or a drift. It was a deliberate, focused movement. The USB cable running from the interface to the computer lifted approximately 2 inches from the desk surface and was held there for perhaps 3 seconds. Not swinging, held, then released. Joel's voice didn't falter. He kept reading. He was on the second to last page. He could feel the cold directly behind him, closer than it had been all morning. The smell of ozone was stronger. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing in a way that he recognized was not from the cold, but from something more primitive than cold. The deep biological alarm of an organism that understands, below the level of conscious thought, that something large and predatory is immediately behind it. He turned the last page. One more paragraph. He read it slowly, the way he always read final paragraphs, giving the words their space, letting them settle. And as he read, he became aware of something that he should have noticed earlier, something that should have alarmed him the moment it occurred, but had registered only slowly through the dense fog of concentration and suppressed terror. The mirror was no longer showing his office. His reflection was still there. He was still visible in the glass, seated at his desk, reading. But behind him, in the mirror's version of the room, there was nothing. No acoustic foam, no cables, no dark wooden door, no hoodie on the back of the chair. Just Joel, seated at a desk in a version of the room that was completely, impossibly empty, as if someone had removed every object from the reflected space except for him. And directly behind his reflected shoulder, in the empty, reflected room, the tall, dark figure stood perfectly still, closer than it had ever been, close enough that its featureless face was level with the top of Joel's head, and its fingers were hovering in the air just inches from his reflected neck. He read the last sentence. He hit stop. He sat in the silence after the recording ended and did not move. The red light went dark. He stared at it. He had expected to feel the cold leave, the way it had left every other time the microphone was muted, retreating cleanly, taking the ozone smell and the old dust smell with it. He waited for that. He needed that. That retreat had been the rule, the reliable constant at the center of everything terrifying and unexplained about the last 4 days. And if the rule held, then he had recorded the last chapter. The deadline would be met, and he could walk out of this room and call Dom and eat something and figure out what came next from a position of daylight and distance. The cold did not leave. He sat very still and felt it behind his chair, unchanged, unhurried, that dense, localized cold that carried the smell of somewhere else and the electrical charge of charged air before a storm. It was still there. The microphone was muted, the recording light was dead, and the entity had not retreated. The rule had changed. He forced himself to look at the mirror. His reflection looked back, pale, rigid, with the particular stillness of someone trying not to transmit fear through their body language to something they believe can read it. The room behind his reflection was normal. The acoustic foam was there. The cables were there. The dark door, the hoodie, everything where it should be. The mirror showed a completely normal office, the same office Joel had worked in for 3 years, unremarkable and familiar in every detail, except that the shadow was gone. Not in the mirror and not behind him, or rather not visibly behind him, because when Joel turned in his chair and looked at the space behind his desk, he saw nothing. The room was empty, lit by the desk lamp and the blue light of the monitor and the overhead bulb he had switched on that morning. The room looked exactly as it should have. He was alone in it. This was exactly what the mirror showed. So why was the cold still there? He stood up. He crossed to the mirror. He stood in front of it and examined his reflection with the attentiveness of a man looking for a discrepancy, some small wrongness that would tell him what he needed to know. His reflection matched. When he raised his right hand, the reflection raised its right hand. When he tilted his head, the reflection tilted its head. He leaned close to the glass, his face a foot from the surface, and stared. He noticed it on the second look. His reflection was breathing. That sounds absurd. Of course a reflection breathes. A reflection is a mirror image. It does what you do. But Joel was holding his breath. He had held it deliberately, consciously, after tilting close to the glass, because he wanted stillness. He wanted to minimize movement. He wanted to look carefully. He was not breathing. His reflection's chest was rising and falling, slowly, rhythmically, with the same wrongly spaced intervals, the same too long pause between inhale and exhale that he had heard in the audio recording 3 nights ago. His reflection was breathing with the breathing of something that was not him. He stepped back from the mirror. 1 step, 2. He bumped into his chair and stopped. He watched his reflection step back with him, perfectly synchronized. Hand movements, weight distribution, all of it correct. But the chest kept moving, rising and falling with that alien rhythm, independent of anything Joel's body was doing, because Joel had not taken a breath in approximately 40 seconds, and his lungs were beginning to insist on the matter. He exhaled, inhaled, looked. His reflection exhaled a beat later, inhaled a beat later. The delay had moved from the shadow's mouth to his own reflection's breath, half a second behind, half a second slow, like a signal traveling a slightly longer distance before it arrives. He looked at the mirror and understood finally what the last 4 days had been. Not a haunting, not a monster in the traditional sense. Something patient and methodical, arriving at this room through the specific frequency of his voice, through the act of speaking into a microphone in a quiet room in the middle of the night, attracted or activated or constructed by the precise acoustic conditions of a professional recording setup tuned to capture the human voice with maximum fidelity. It had come through the mirror because mirrors were thresholds in ways that glass had always been, reflective, duplicating, showing a version of what is real while remaining technically other. And it had been replacing him, piece by piece. The breathing, the head tilt, the independent movement, it had been learning him. He thought about Renata, who would receive the completed audio files before 9 this morning. He thought about her listening through the narration in her studio with professional monitors and headphones, reviewing the work the way she always did, carefully, attentively, her experienced ear calibrated to every nuance of his voice. He thought about whether she would hear the difference. He thought about the frost handprint that was no longer on the mirror. He had not noticed it was gone until this moment. At some point between last night and now, the frost had disappeared, not melted, not evaporated in the way moisture evaporates from glass, just gone. The surface of the mirror smooth and clean as if it had never been there. As if whatever had left it no longer needed to announce itself from the other side. He looked at his reflection. His reflection looked back at him. He raised his hand. The reflection raised its hand with a fractional delay that a stranger would have never noticed, would have attributed to the natural imperceptibility of mirror lag, would have passed right by in the way the brain passes by things it doesn't want to see. Joel noticed. He was still standing in front of the mirror when the door to the office opened and he walked in. He watched it happen. He watched a figure that looked precisely like him. His height, his face, his gray hoodie, his particular way of holding its shoulders slightly forward, push the door open and walk into the room and go directly to the desk and sit down and place its hands on the desk's surface with the deliberate stillness of someone who belongs in that space. It sat at his desk. It looked at his monitor. It reached forward and opened the audio files from the morning session and began scrolling through the waveforms with the practiced eye of someone who has done this thousands of times. Joel stood in front of the mirror and felt the cold move through him, into him, around him. He tried to speak. He was not certain whether the sound reached the air of the room or whether it remained on his side of the glass, trapped in the space behind the surface where the frost handprints went and where the tall, dark figure had stood for 4 nights, watching him, learning him, preparing. The figure at the desk did not look up. It moved with his gestures, breathed with his rhythm, sat with his posture. From outside the room, from the hallway, from any point of view that was not directly in front of this mirror, there was nothing unusual. There was a voice actor at his desk, reviewing his files before sending them to his producer. There was a professional doing his work. There was nothing wrong. Joel pressed his hands against the glass from the inside. The frost bloomed outward from his palms in slow crystalline branches. It would not melt. Nobody would come to check. And in his home office at 8:45 in the morning, the recording light on the audio interface glowed red again. Because the thing at his desk was already working on the next project, the next narration, the next long night of speaking in a quiet room in front of a mirror with a microphone aimed at its borrowed mouth, sending his voice out into the world from inside the body it had spent 4 sessions learning to wear. While Joel watched from behind the glass, from the cold, from the silence on the other side of the mirror that nobody would ever record or deliver or hear. The red light stayed on. The work continued.